She was supposed to be invisible. Maya Rogers, 23 years old, art history genius turned waitress, had one job at Il Palazzo. Serve the wine, clear the plates, and disappear. But tonight, in the restaurant's most exclusive private suite, Lorenzo Romano, New York's most feared mafia boss, is about to sign a $150 million contract to reclaim his family's ancestral Sicilian estates. The document looks perfect. The experts swear it's authentic. The ink is right. The age is right. The seal is right. Except it isn't. And Maya, standing in the shadows with a water pitcher and a photographic memory for Renaissance iconography, has exactly one chance to do the impossible. Speak 6 words in Sicilian that will stop a catastrophic fraud, expose a deadly conspiracy, and reveal that the invisible waitress in the corner knows more about his heritage than his own historians. November rain in Manhattan was theatrical, the kind that made the city look like it belonged in a film noir. On East 57th Street, where Bentleys idled at red lights and doormen wore white gloves year-round, Illinois Palazzo rose 5 stories of limestone and old-world power. To call it a restaurant was technically accurate, but spiritually insufficient. Il Palazzo was where oligarchs brokered deals, where senators made backroom agreements, where conversations that never appeared in official records happened over $400 bottles of wine. The dress code wasn't posted because if you had to ask, you didn't belong. And moving through this temple of power every evening, carrying trays and wearing a uniform that might as well have been camouflage, was Maya Rogers. At 23, Maya had become an expert at eraser. Her dark hair was always pulled back so tightly it made her temples throb. Her uniform, white button-down, black vest, black slacks, was always pristine. Her expression was always pleasant but blank. She moved through the dining room like water, filling gaps, anticipating needs, never drawing attention. She was invisible by necessity because if anyone looked too closely, they might recognize her. 3 years ago, Maya Rogers had been the youngest person to ever receive the Wythe Fellowship in Italian Renaissance Studies. Her undergraduate thesis on forgery techniques in 16th-century papal documents had been published in 2 academic journals. She'd been offered research positions at the Met, the Fic, and the Getty. Then her mother got sick, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Elena Rogers didn't believe in 6-month prognosis. She believed in experimental treatments that cost $40,000 a month and weren't covered by insurance. Maya had made a choice. The fellowships paid $35,000 a year. Il Palazzo's servers made that in 3 months. So she disappeared, ghosted her academic advisors, stopped answering emails from Christie's and Seabees, put her degrees in a drawer, and put on an apron instead. That was 3 years ago. Her mother was still alive, stubbornly, expensively alive, and Maya was still invisible until tonight. Rogers, Mr. Benedetti, the restaurant's general manager, had the kind of voice that could curdle hollandaise. Private suite, 3rd floor, 7 o'clock. Lorenzo Romano does not tolerate mistakes. The name meant nothing to Maya, which meant she'd been successfully invisible for 3 years. Kitchen staff knew better. The sous chef had crossed himself when he heard. At 6:45 p.m., Maya presented herself at the 3rd floor security checkpoint. A man built like a concrete wall scanned her with a metal detector, checked her ID, and gestured her through without a word. The private suite was breathtaking. Coffered ceilings, silk wallpaper, windows overlooking the city like a kingdom. A single table set for 7 dominated the space. At 700 p. exactly, Lorenzo Romano arrived. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the kind of physical presence that made expensive suits look like armor. Dark hair, dark eyes, Mediterranean features that belonged in a Caravaggio painting. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. With him came an entourage, an older man with steel gray hair, a woman in her 40s carrying a briefcase, 2 younger men who were clearly security despite their tailored suits. Maya poured water, still not sparkling, and vanished into the corner. At 7:15, the guests arrived. Richard Blackwood, American 50s expensive suit, smiled like a predator. With him was Dr. Julia Santoro, a severe Italian woman clutching a leather portfolio like it contained nuclear launch codes. Blackwood's voice was warm whiskey and cold calculation. Tonight will be historic. Lorenzo's handshake was brief. Show me. Santoro placed her portfolio on the table with ceremonial gravity. Inside, nestled in archival foam, was a document that made Maya's breath catch. Parchment, genuine, yellowed, covered in dense handwritten Italian. A large wax seal at the bottom, crimson and ornate. The Romano Grant of 1485. Santoro announced, signed by Pope Innocent VI, confirming your family's hereditary rights to the Castello de Monte Verde estates in Sicily, authenticated by the Vatican Archives, the University of Bologna, and the Sicilian Historical Society. Maya was supposed to be arranging bread plates. Instead, every cell in her body had gone on high alert. She knew that papal seal. She'd spent 6 months studying Innocent Yates bulls for her thesis. She could draw that seal from memory, and something about it was wrong. Blackwood continued smoothly. With this document, you have legal standing to reclaim estates worth an estimated $300 million. All you need is to sign the contract and transfer the purchase price. The older man, Costa, leaned forward, studied the parchment through reading glasses. Cerbra authentico. It seems authentic because it was authentic. The parchment was real 15th century vellum. The ink was real period iron gall. Even the wax was genuine 15th century beeswax. But the document itself was wrong. Maya had studied Innocent VIII's papal bulls obsessively. His seals used a specific format. Crossed keys beneath the 3-tiered tiara. The gold key always faced Dexter right from the viewer's perspective. This seal showed the gold key facing sinister left. It was microscopic. The kind of detail even experts might miss. The kind of mistake that happened when Forgers worked from photographs without understanding heraldic conventions. Someone had taken a genuine 15th century blank document and added fraudulent text, then sealed it with a technically correct but symbolically wrong seal. It was brilliant, nearly perfect, a $150 million lie. Lorenzo picked up a fountain pen, heavy gold, the kind that signed treaties. Once you sign and transfer the funds, Blackwood said, sliding papers forward, the document is legally yours. The pen hovered over paper. Maya had 3 seconds to decide who she was going to be. The invisible waitress who kept her head down. Or the scholar who couldn't watch a masterpiece fraud happen without speaking. Her mother's voice weak from chemo, but fierce. Truth matters, Maya. When it stops mattering, we stop being human. The pen touched paper. Aspi and memento. Wait a moment. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in that room's silence, it was a gunshot. Everyone turned. Security hands moved toward jackets. Blackwood's smile froze. Santoro looked confused, and Lorenzo Romano, very slowly, put down the pen and turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable. His voice was soft, dangerous. She say too, who are you? Maya's heart hammered. Her hands shook. Her entire life was about to implode, but the fraud on that table couldn't stand. She stepped forward out of the shadows, out of invisibility. This was Professor Edmund Ashford, 70-some Oxford credentials, the kind of academic gravitas that came with 3 decades of published papers and a CBE from the Queen. Behind them rolled a security case the size of a small coffin. Romano, Blackwood purred, extending his hand. Lorenzo shook it with exactly the amount of pressure required to convey civility without warmth. Thank you for this second chance. I assure you, after our misunderstanding, I've been extraordinarily careful. Show me, Lorenzo said. Professor Whitmore cleared his throat with the authority of someone who'd spent his life lecturing to people who were required to listen. Romano, what I'm about to present represents perhaps the most significant historical document related to your family to surface in a century. Oh good, Maya thought. We're starting with hyperbole. That's always a great sign. With theatrical precision, Whitmore unlocked the case. Inside, cushioned on burgundy velvet, lay a manuscript that made Maya's breath catch despite her cynicism. It was a bound codex, maybe 30 pages. The vellum yellowed to the color of aged cream, the binding cracked leather that had seen centuries. The cover bore an embossed seal, a crowned lion holding a sword surrounded by text in elaborate Gothic script. The Romano Codex, Whitmore announced, compiled in 1478 by the Sicilian notary Francesco Torino, documenting 3 generations of land grants, marriage alliances, and papal dispensations granted to the Romano family. This is not simply a deed. This is a genealogical and legal record that establishes your family's legitimate claim to the Duche of Bellavista, including the fortress of Montefiore and approximately 40,000 acres of Sicilian territory. Maya was refilling water glasses, moving with the practiced invisibility she'd honed over 3 years, but her eyes were locked on the manuscript. It was beautiful. The calligraphy was exquisite, real 15th century work. She could tell from the rhythm of the script, the way certain letters connected. The vellum was genuine, properly aged with the subtle texture that only centuries could create. But something was wrong. The provenance, Blackwood interjected smoothly, is impeccable. Recovered from the private library of the Maris of Palermo, whose family served as custodians of Sicilian noble records for 4 centuries, Professor Whitmore has spent 8 months on authentication. Whitmore nodded with the gravity of Moses presenting the tablets. The carbon dating places the vellum between 1465 and 1485. The ink is period-appropriate iron gall compound. The binding technique matches documented 15th century Sicilian bookmaking practices. I have molecular analysis, spectroscopic data, and comparative paleographic studies. Who needs a castle this badly? Maya wondered, watching Lorenzo's face remain perfectly composed, while Blackwood quoted a price that had 8 figures. Wait, 40,000 acres in Sicily. That's not a castle. That's a small country with really good pasta. Costa was examining the Codex now, turning pages with white-gloved hands. His expression showed grudging admiration. The script is Sicilian court style, late Quattrocento. Precisely, Whitmore beamed. Note the distinctive. Maya's hand froze mid-pour. The inscription on the seal, the text surrounding the crowned lion. She'd been reading it subconsciously while trying to look like she wasn't paying attention. Sigil VM familiar diento dvis alavi seal of the Romano family Duke of Bellavista. It was in Latin, clean formal textbook Latin. And it was completely wrong. In 15th century Sicily, especially in official seals and documents related to noble families, the language wasn't pure Latin. It was a hybrid Latin structure with Sicilian vernacular insertions reflecting the unique cultural blend of Norman, Arab, and Italian influences that defined Sicilian nobility. A real seal from 1478 would have included Sicilian linguistic markers. It would have used DI instead of DE, would have incorporated Sicilian spelling conventions, would have shown the linguistic fingerprints of the island's complex cultural identity. This seal was written in the kind of Latin a forger would use if they'd learned it from a textbook instead of from studying actual 15th century Sicilian documents. It was a tiny thing, microscopic, the kind of detail that someone like Professor Whitmore, for all his credentials and his molecular analysis, might miss if he'd spent his career studying English and Italian documents, but not specifically Sicilian ones. Maya's heart started hammering. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the water pitcher. Don't say anything. The rational part of her brain screamed. You've been employed for 3 days. Blackwood is already suspicious of you after the paper bowl incident. If you're wrong, you look like an idiot. If you're right, you're going to humiliate an Oxford professor and blow up a $200 million deal. Lorenzo was reaching for his pen. Blackwood was sliding the contract forward, his smile growing wider. The seal is wrong. Maya's expertise insisted. The Latin is too formal. It's a forgery. But she was 3 days into a job that paid for her mother's treatments. 3 days into not being invisible. 3 days into having a purpose beyond surviving. If you're wrong, you lose everything. Lorenzo uncapped the pen. The sound seemed impossibly loud. If you're right and stay silent, you're not the scholar your mother raised. You're just another person who let a lie survive because the truth was inconvenient. Maya's mouth opened and the room held its breath, waiting for the invisible girl to speak. Non avevo a falso. It wasn't true. It was fake. The words left Maya's mouth before her brain could stop them. 5 words in Italian that detonated in the conference room like a flashbang grenade. Time didn't slow. It stopped. Blackwood's smile froze mid-expansion. Professor Whitmore's hand, reaching to point out some detail in the manuscript, hung suspended in midair. Costa's eyes snapped to Maya with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. The bodyguards' hands moved toward their jackets in synchronized motion that would have been beautiful if it weren't terrifying. And Lorenzo simply stopped. The pen, millimeters from paper, held perfectly still. He didn't turn around, didn't move, just stopped. The silence was so complete, Maya could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Could hear the faint hum of the climate control system. Could hear Blackwood's breath catch like a man who'd just watched a grenade roll under his chair. Oh God, Maya thought, her entire body flooding with ice-cold adrenaline. Oh God, what did I just do? Then Lorenzo spoke. His voice was soft, the kind of soft that made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit. Chiha Parlato. Who spoke? Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Maya's legs had turned to water. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to grip the water pitcher to keep from dropping it. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to let someone else take the blame, to disappear back into invisibility where it was safe. But she'd already jumped. Might as well enjoy the fall. I did, she said, her voice embarrassingly unsteady. Sir, Lorenzo turned in his chair slowly, deliberately, with the mechanical precision of a gun turret tracking a target. His eyes found hers across the table, and Maya felt like she was being examined under a microscope or possibly through a rifle scope. Repeat. I said. Maya swallowed, her throat suddenly desert dry. I said it's not true. It's fake. The room exploded. Blackwood lunged forward, his polished veneer cracking like cheap paint. This is outrageous, mister. This girl is clearly sentient. Lorenzo's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. The vellum might be real. The ink might be period accurate, but the language is wrong. It's a forgery using authentic materials. The silence that followed could have shattered diamonds. Blackwood found his voice first. This is absurd. Professor Whitmore is one of the world's leading Italian and English manuscript experts, Maya said, her terror somehow transmuting into something that felt dangerously close to confidence. I read your publications, Professor. They're brilliant. Really. Your work on Tudor-era documents is groundbreaking. But how many Sicilian noble seals have you authenticated? Whitmore's face went from pink to crimson. I've examined dozens of Italian documents from Florence, Venice, Rome, not Sicilian. Maya turned to Lorenzo, who was watching this exchange with the focused intensity of a predator deciding which prey was worth chasing. Sicily isn't Italy. Not in the 15th century. Different linguistic patterns, different cultural influences, different everything. A forger working from Italian templates wouldn't know that. They'd use formal Latin because that's what Italian noble seals used. But Sicilian seals were different. Costa had picked up the Codex, was examining the seal with new eyes. He pulled out a phone, typed something, waited. His expression darkened. Capo, he said quietly. She might be right. Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely. This is ridiculous. You're going to trust a waitress over one of Oxford's finest. Former waitress, Maya corrected, because apparently her survival instincts had completely abandoned her. Current whatever I am now, professional grammar pedant. Lorenzo's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Then he turned to Professor Whitmore with an expression that made the temperature drop 10 degrees. Professor, did you personally verify the linguistic patterns of the seal inscription against authenticated 15th century Sicilian documents? Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The seal matched the general stylistic patterns of the period. That's not what I asked. The professor's shoulders sagged. No, I did not specifically compare it to Sicilian linguistic patterns. Lorenzo set down his pen with the finality of a judge's gavel. Then we have a problem. Blackwood made one last desperate play. Romano, surely you're not going to allow Fry out. Lorenzo's voice was arctic. Take your Codex, take your expert, and get out of my building before I decide that attempted fraud deserves a more permanent response than embarrassment. Blackwood and Whitmore scrambled for the case with the desperate energy of men who'd just been granted an unexpected stay of execution. The bodyguards escorted them to the elevator with the kind of gentle encouragement usually reserved for livestock heading to slaughter. The doors closed. The suite was suddenly devastatingly quiet. Is that going to get me killed? Eventually. Probably. His smile was sharp now. But not by me. You're going to get promoted. Maya's legs finally gave up the fight. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Gracia Dio, she muttered. Thank God. Don't thank God yet, Lorenzo said. Thank him when we find whoever's creating these forgeries, because tomorrow we're going hunting. And Maya realized that stopping time was easy. Living with the consequences was going to be the hard part. The office Lorenzo led her to wasn't an office. It was a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, furniture that belonged in a design museum, and a desk made from a single piece of black walnut that probably required its own insurance policy. Everything was sharp angles and clean lines, the aesthetic of someone who'd eliminated anything soft from their life as a matter of survival. Lorenzo closed the door. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. Maya's newfound confidence evaporated instantly. She was alone in a room with a man whose business card probably just read "problem solved" in elegant serif font. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of two leather chairs facing the desk. The chair was obscenely comfortable, which somehow made this worse. "At least if I'm about to be murdered, I'll die with good lumbar support," she thought hysterically. Lorenzo didn't sit behind the desk, the traditional power position. Instead, he sat in the chair next to hers, angled so he could watch her face, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow. The precise way his hair was cut, the small gold cuff links that probably cost more than her mother's monthly medication bill. So he said conversationally, "Maya Rogers, Columbia graduate, Wythe Fellow, published scholar." He paused. "3-year gap in your CV where you disappeared completely. Want to tell me why?" "Not particularly," Maya said, then winced. "Sorry," reflex answer. "My therapist says I use sarcasm as a defense mechanism." "Your therapist is correct." His expression didn't change. "Answer the question." "My mother got sick. Cancer. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. Academic fellowships pay roughly the same as starvation wages. Il Palazzo paid actual money. Math is math. So you walked away from a brilliant career to serve wine to people who wouldn't know a Caravaggio from a calendar. I walked away from a brilliant career to keep my mother alive." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "Sorry if that doesn't fit the narrative of tragic academic genius. I made a choice. I'd make it again." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but recognition. Like he understood choices made between impossible options. "And now you're working for me," he said. "Doing exactly what you were trained to do, making more money than you ever would have in academia with better health care than any university would provide." He tilted his head slightly. "Does that bother you? That I'm working for someone who's definitely involved in criminal enterprise?" Maya asked. "Or that I'm really good at it?" She considered lying. Considered giving the answer that would make her seem morally righteous or appropriately conflicted, then decided that lying to a man who probably had people killed for less than dishonesty was strategically inadvisable. "Yes," she said simply, "it bothers me. But not enough to stop. My mother's alive because of the money I'm making. I can live with moral ambiguity if she can live. Period." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a leather portfolio. He returned, opened it, and placed a document in front of her. It was old, 15th century by the look of it. Parchment, faded ink, elaborate seal. The text was in medieval Italian with Latin phrases interwoven. "Read it," he said. Maya leaned forward, her scholar's brain engaging automatically. The script was challenging, abbreviated Latin mixed with vernacular Italian, the kind of hybrid that took years to learn to parse correctly. "It's a land transfer," she said slowly, tracing the text with her eyes. "Dated 1463, transferring ownership of I think it's a vineyard near Montalcino from the Salvi family to," she paused, examining a particularly elaborate signature, "to someone named Romano, your ancestor. My great-grandfather 13 times removed." He pointed to a section of text that was particularly faded. "What does that say?" Maya squinted at it. The ink had degraded badly, and someone had clearly tried to restore it at some point with less than ideal results. But underneath the damage, she could see the ghost of the original text. "Cudi render tense," she read, "with all rights, rents, and appurtenances." Standard medieval property transfer language. She looked up at him. "Because I paid $3 million for that document 5 years ago, and 3 experts told me it was authentic." Maya looked back at the parchment, her pulse quickening. This was a test. Everything was a test with him. She examined the seal more carefully, looked at the ink patterns, studied the way the text flowed. Then she noticed something. A tiny inconsistency in the spacing. A subtle difference in ink density in one section. "The document is authentic," she said slowly. "But it's been altered. Tonight, you stepped into the light. Because the truth mattered more than safety." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect. What do you want, Maya Rogers? My job back. My mother's treatment is in 2 weeks. Basta. He pulled out his phone. You don't work for Benedetti anymore. You work for me. Authentication, collections, finding lies. He leaned forward. I need someone who sees what others miss. I'm not a criminal. Neither am I. Officially, his smile was sharp. How much does it pay? His lawyer slid over a paper. The number made Maya choke. Per week, Lorenzo clarified. Plus full medical coverage. Any treatment. Any doctor anywhere. What's the price? Loyalty, truth, even when inconvenient. His eyes held hers. Can you do that? Maya thought of her mother. The bills. 3 years of invisibility. Thought of the rush when truth met power and power listened. Lorenzo extended his hand. Benvenuta nella familia amurita. Welcome to the family. Outside, rain had stopped. The city glittered and Maya Rogers, invisible for 3 years, was finally terrifyingly, gloriously seen. 3 days after Maya Rogers stopped being invisible, she found herself in a penthouse suite that made Il Palazzo look like a subway station. Lorenzo's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building in Tribeca that officially belonged to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The windows offered a view of Manhattan that looked like a particularly ambitious CGI rendering, all glittering towers and impossibly clean streets. The furniture was the kind of mid-century modern that cost more than most people's mortgages. Everything was cream and chrome and cold perfection, except for the conference room, which looked like a bunker had married a museum. The walls were lined with climate-controlled glass cases displaying artifacts that probably shouldn't exist outside of the 8C. A Bellini sketch, what looked suspiciously like a lost Tizhan study, a Xantine icon that Maya was fairly certain had been listed as missing since 1943. She didn't ask. That was rule 1 of her new employment. Don't ask where things come from. The table itself was a slab of black walnut that could have doubled as a landing strip surrounded by 12 leather chairs that probably cost more than her Columbia tuition. At the head sat Lorenzo, dressed in a charcoal suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a Renaissance portrait titled Portrait of Power Personified. Around him, Costa, the conciliary, looking like everyone's dangerous uncle. Elena, the lawyer with her tablet and her expression of permanent calculation. 2 bodyguards whose names Maya didn't know and suspected she wasn't supposed to ask, and Marco, a translator who spoke 6 languages and had the energy of a particularly nervous rabbit. Now, he said when Maya had settled into her chair with her notebook and the kind of coffee that cost more per pound than some people made in a week, we discuss authentication protocols. For the next hour, they reviewed procedures. How acquisitions were vetted. How documents were verified. Who had access to which information. Maya took notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that missing details in Lorenzo's world could be fatal. But as they talked, a pattern emerged. Someone had been very, very careful. In the last 18 months, Lorenzo had purchased 47 documents. 23 had been authenticated by Elena, his lawyer who supposedly specialized in Renaissance art law. 12 had been verified by Professor Charles Whitmore from Oxford. 8 had come with authentication from Dr. Giulia Santoro, the Italian scholar who tried to sell them the Romano Codex. Only 4 had been verified by completely independent sources. Someone had been building a network. Someone had been very patient. After the meeting, Maya stayed behind. She had questions, and in Lorenzo's world, questions were dangerous things that required careful handling. The others filed out, leaving Maya alone with Lorenzo in a room that suddenly felt much more intimate than its actual square footage. You have something to say, Lorenzo observed. He was still sitting at the head of the table, but his posture was less formal now, more relaxed. You've been targeted, she said. This isn't random. Someone has been systematically inserting themselves into your acquisition process. Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Explain. Maya pulled out her notebook, flipped to a page covered in her neat handwriting. 3 authenticators handling 85% of your purchases in 18 months. Elena, your lawyer. Professor Whitmore, who somehow manages to authenticate an unusual number of Sicilian documents for someone based in England. And Dr. Santoro, who just tried to sell you a $150 million forgery. She looked up at him. Someone recruited them. Someone who knows your interests, your collecting patterns, your financial capacity. Someone who's been playing a very long game. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Who? Lorenzo said quietly. Someone close enough to know your business. Someone with access to your acquisition schedules. Someone who could coordinate with forgers and bend academics. Maya set down her pen. Someone who could have fed Elena information about what you were looking for. Someone who could have recommended Professor Whitmore to you. Someone who could have arranged for Dr. Santoro to approach you at exactly the right time with exactly the right document. Lorenzo stood, walked to the windows, his silhouette dark against the Manhattan skyline. Three possibilities, she continued. Someone in your organization is compromised. Someone outside your organization has been watching you for months, maybe years. Or Maya hesitated, then pushed forward because in Lorenzo's world, holding back information was more dangerous than sharing it. Or someone you trust has been betraying you from the beginning. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Then Lorenzo turned back to her, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Tomorrow, he said, we find out which one it is. And Maya realized that working for Lorenzo Romano wasn't just about authentication anymore. It was about survival. That night, Maya sat in her small Queens apartment, looking at bank statements and medical bills and the kind of paperwork that defined a life lived on the edges of financial disaster. On her kitchen table, next to a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, was the contract Lorenzo had given her. The numbers were still impossible to believe. More money per week than she'd made in 6 months at Il Palazzo. Health insurance that would cover her mother's treatments without question. Dental, vision, life insurance. Everything she'd been desperately cobbling together for 3 years. All she had to do was work for a man who probably had people killed and definitely collected stolen art. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. How is the new job, sweetie? Are you safe? Maya stared at the message for a long time. How do you explain to your mother that you've just signed on to work for the Mafia? That you're trading your soul for her life? That you'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat? She typed back. It's good, Mom. Different. I'll tell you more tomorrow. Another buzz. I love you. Be careful. Maya looked around her apartment. The leaking ceiling in the bathroom. The radiator that clanged like a percussion section. The secondhand furniture and the expired food in the refrigerator because she'd been living on ramen for months to pay for her mother's medication. Then she looked at the contract. At the promise of enough money to give her mother real treatment. Real hope. She signed it. Whatever happened next, at least her mother would live. The next morning, Maya arrived at the Tribeca building to find it in controlled chaos. Security guards with earpieces escorted her to the elevator. The 42nd floor was bustling with activity that looked professional but felt military. Costa met her at the elevator. Dr. Rogers, he said with a formality that hadn't been there the day before. Capo wants to see you immediately. The urgency in his voice made Maya's stomach clench. She followed him through the offices to Lorenzo's private suite, where she found him standing behind his desk with the focused intensity of a general planning a war. Maya, he said without preamble. How quickly can you analyze a document? Depends on the document. How quickly? For a preliminary assessment. 10 minutes. If it's obviously fake. For a detailed authentication, hours. If it's sophisticated. We don't have hours. He turned his laptop around. On the screen was a photograph of a medieval manuscript. The image quality wasn't great, clearly taken with a phone camera and poor lighting, but Maya could make out enough details to know it was serious. This arrived an hour ago, Lorenzo said, along with a ransom demand. Someone has kidnapped Marco, my translator. They want $5 million, and they want me to authenticate and purchase this document as payment. Maya leaned closer to the screen, her scholar's brain engaging automatically despite the horrific circumstances. The manuscript appeared to be a bound codex, maybe 15th century by the script style. The cover showed an elaborate coat of arms, definitely Italian, possibly Sicilian. Someone kidnapped your employee to force you to buy a specific document. It's not about the money, she said, realization dawning. It's about the document. They need you to legitimize something. To put it in your collection where it will gain value and credibility. Lorenzo nodded grimly. The question is whether the document is authentic or whether this is another forgery. If it's real, paying $5 million for Marco's life is expensive but manageable. If it's fake, I'm not just being robbed, I'm being set up. For what? Maya asked. Lorenzo's expression was grim. To establish a pattern. If they can force me to purchase known forgeries, they can eventually use that to destroy my credibility, my business relationships, possibly my freedom. No one stays in power in this business if they can't be trusted to know real from fake. So you need to authenticate the document before you decide whether to pay. Maya said, "How long until the deadline?" 6 hours. And Maya realized that Marco's life depended on her ability to spot a forgery from a single photograph. No pressure at all. She studied the image more carefully, zooming in on details. The script looked right for the period. The binding appeared authentic. The coat of arms was elaborate, but not inconsistent with 15th century Sicilian noble families. But something bothered her. The photograph had been taken in what looked like a warehouse or industrial space. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting. Not the kind of environment where a legitimate seller would store a priceless medieval manuscript. Either the kidnappers don't understand proper conservation, she said, or they're not planning to keep the document long-term. Lorenzo's eyes sharpened. Meaning this whole setup is temporary. They grabbed Marco, grabbed the document from wherever they were storing it, and now they're trying to move both quickly. Which suggests Maya paused, thinking through the implications. Which suggests they're working under pressure. Someone else is after them. The forgery ring isn't just targeting you. They're being hunted. By whom? That's the question. But if I'm right, we don't have 6 hours. We have less time than that before this entire situation explodes. Lorenzo walked to a safe hidden behind a painting that probably cost more than Maya's college education. He pulled out a briefcase and set it on his desk. Inside, nestled in custom foam, were tools that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit or possibly a spy movie. Portable X-ray equipment, chemical testing strips, a digital microscope with changeable lenses. "You're going to authenticate the document in person," he said. "Before I pay the ransom, I need to know what I'm buying." Maya stared at the equipment. "This is insane. You want me to examine a medieval manuscript in some warehouse while armed kidnappers are holding your employee. I want you to save Marco's life by making sure I don't walk into a trap." Lorenzo's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "If the document is fake, this isn't a ransom. It's an ambush. And if I show up with $5 million based on bad information, Marco and I will both end up dead." Maya looked at the briefcase, then at Lorenzo. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not just determination, but worry. Real concern for Marco that went beyond simple business calculations. "You care about him," she realized. "He's been with my family for 12 years, Lorenzo said quietly. "He saved my life twice. I'm not abandoning him. But I'm also not walking into a suicide mission based on a blurry photograph." Maya took a deep breath. "What makes you think they'll let me examine the document?" "Because they want the sale to look legitimate. If I show up with an authentication expert, it fits their story. They're selling, not stealing. It maintains the fiction. And if something goes wrong, Costa will be with you," Lorenzo said. "He's kept me alive this long. He can keep you alive for one afternoon." Maya looked at the briefcase again. The tools were beautiful, precision instruments that represented years of scientific advancement in art authentication. Part of her, the scholar part that had been dormant for 3 years, was excited by the challenge. The rest of her was terrified. "If I do this," she said, "if I help you save Marco, I want something in addition to the salary." Lorenzo raised an eyebrow. "I want the truth. About what you do, who you are, what I'm really working for. Complete honesty." Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "If we both survive this, you'll have it. Deal." "Deal." And Maya Rogers, former invisible waitress, current art authentication expert, prepared to walk into a kidnapping situation armed with nothing but scientific instruments and the ability to spot a 500-year-old lie. The warehouse was exactly what Maya had expected. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, the kind of industrial space that could be rented quickly and abandoned without questions. What she hadn't expected was how terrified she would be. Costa parked 3 blocks away, did a perimeter check that took 20 minutes, and finally led Maya to a side entrance with the professional efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Don't speak unless spoken to. If something goes wrong, hit the ground and stay down." "What happens if the document is fake?" Maya asked. Costa's smile was sharp. "Then we improvise." The interior of the warehouse was divided into sections with temporary walls. They were led through a maze of corridors to a central area that had been converted into a makeshift office. Folding tables, industrial lighting, and in the center, sitting under a halogen lamp like it was on display in a museum, was the manuscript. Maya's breath caught. Even from across the room, she could see it was beautiful. The cover was worked leather with metal fittings that gleamed despite their age. The pages, visible through the slightly open binding, showed the kind of illuminated script that took months to create. Two men stood near the table. One was clearly muscle, the kind of heavy-set intimidation that came standard in Lorenzo's world. The other was older, maybe 60, with the look of someone who'd spent his life around books and artifacts. An academic, Maya realized. They've got a bent scholar working with them. The academic stepped forward, extending his hand with the artificial courtesy of someone conducting business at gunpoint. Dr. Rogers, I presume. I'm Professor Kellner. Thank you for coming. Maya shook his hand, noting the ink stains on his fingers, the slight tremor that suggested either nerves or too much caffeine. She didn't see Marco anywhere, which either meant he was being held elsewhere or was already dead. Where's your translator? She asked. Safe, Kellner assured her. Mr. Marco will be returned unharmed once the transaction is complete. Costa stepped closer to Maya, his hand inside his jacket. The transaction hasn't started yet, he said quietly. First, the lady examines the merchandise. Kellner gestured toward the table. Of course. Please, Dr. Rogers, take all the time you need. But Maya was already walking toward the manuscript, her scholar's instincts overriding her fear. This was what she was trained for. This was what she was good at. The manuscript was a thing of beauty. The binding was definitely 15th century, worked leather with brass fittings that had acquired the patina of age. The pages were vellum, properly prepared and aged, with hand lettering that showed the characteristic variations of medieval scribes. She opened it carefully, her hands automatically falling into the proper handling techniques she'd learned in graduate school. The script was Gothic, transitioning into Renaissance, consistent with late 15th century Italian bookmaking. The illuminated capitals were exquisite, gold leaf and mineral pigments that had held their color across centuries. The text was in Latin with Italian vernacular insertions, documenting what appeared to be a complex business transaction involving multiple noble families. So far, everything looked authentic. Maya pulled out her portable equipment, trying to ignore the men watching her every movement. The paper analysis came first. She took microscopic samples from the edges, testing the composition and age of the vellum. The results were consistent with 15th century preparation methods. Next, she tested the ink. Iron gall, the standard for the period, with trace elements that suggested Italian origin. The binding materials checked out. Even the thread used to sew the pages was consistent with medieval bookmaking techniques. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Maya frowned, studying the manuscript more closely. In her experience, authentic medieval documents showed inconsistencies. Variations in ink density where a scribe had paused to refill his pen. Minor corrections where mistakes had been scratched out and rewritten. Small stains or damage from centuries of handling. This manuscript showed none of that. It was too clean, too uniform, too pristine. Like someone had created an idealized version of what a 15th century document should look like. She examined the binding more closely, looking for tool marks that would indicate how the leather had been worked. Medieval bookbinders used specific techniques, often leaving characteristic patterns in the leather. These patterns were there, but they were too regular, too consistent. Like someone had studied medieval binding techniques and reproduced them with machine precision. The illuminated capitals were beautiful, but under magnification, Maya could see that the gold leaf was too pure. Medieval gold leaf contained trace elements from the period's refining techniques. This gold was too clean, suggesting modern preparation methods. Dr. Rogers. Kellner's voice held a note of impatience. Your assessment. Maya looked up from the manuscript, acutely aware that her next words would determine whether Marco lived or died. The document is a masterpiece of forgery, she said clearly. 15th century materials, but modern construction techniques. Someone with access to authentic vellum and period pigments created this, but they created it recently. Very recently. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Costa moved, his hand coming out of his jacket with a weapon that looked military-grade. The muscle took a step toward them, and Maya found herself caught between two armed groups with Marco's life hanging in the balance. Kellner's facade of scholarly courtesy evaporated. "You're certain?" "Absolutely. The materials are authentic, but the assembly is modern. Someone has been very patient and very skilled, but this is not a 15th century manuscript." The muscle reached for his own weapon, but Costa was faster. The shot echoed through the warehouse like thunder. Maya hit the ground, her hands instinctively protecting the manuscript even as gunfire erupted around her. Through the chaos, she heard Costa shouting coordinates into his radio, calling for backup. More shots, the sound of running feet, and then sudden, terrifying silence. "Maya." Costa's voice, much closer now. "Are you hit?" "No," she managed, her voice shaky. "The manuscript. It's undamaged." "Good. We need to move. Now." Costa pulled her to her feet, his eyes scanning the warehouse for threats. Kellner was down, not dead but wounded. The muscle was unconscious, or worse, and Marco. Marco was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Maya asked. Costa was already moving toward the exit, pulling Maya with him. "That's what we're going to find out." Because this was just the beginning. The real question was who had been sophisticated enough to create a forgery using authentic 15th century materials, and why they had been willing to kidnap and kill to get Lorenzo to authenticate it. As they ran through the warehouse toward the exit, Maya realized that she'd just passed her first real test as Lorenzo's authentication expert. She'd spotted the forgery, kept Marco's ransom from being paid for a fake, and survived her first gunfight. What she didn't know was whether Marco had survived too. Outside, sirens were approaching. Costa bundled Maya into a car that had appeared as if by magic, and they sped away from the warehouse toward an uncertain future. But Maya was no longer the invisible waitress who served wine and cleared plates. She was Lorenzo Romano's authentication expert, and she'd just proven that in his world, the ability to spot a lie could mean the difference between life and death. For everyone, the safe house was different this time. Instead of luxury disguised as fortress, this was fortress without pretense. An industrial building in Queens that looked abandoned from the outside, but was anything but. Motion sensors, cameras, enough armed security to outfit a small army. Maya sat in what might generously be called a conference room, watching Lorenzo pace with the controlled energy of a caged predator. Marco was alive. They'd found him in a second warehouse, bound and unconscious but unharmed. He was currently being checked by a doctor while Lorenzo's people interrogated the surviving kidnappers. What they'd learned wasn't comforting. "This isn't random," Lorenzo said, stopping his pacing to face Maya. "The forgery ring has been planning this for over a year. They knew my purchasing patterns, my authentication methods, even my personal relationships. Someone has been watching me very carefully." Maya looked up from the photographs scattered across the table. Images of the forged manuscript, the warehouse, the kidnappers, and several other documents that Lorenzo's people had recovered. "The level of sophistication is incredible," she said. "Whoever created that manuscript had access to authentic 15th century vellum, period pigments, even the right type of thread. That's not something you can just buy on eBay." Lorenzo's expression was grim. "Which means they either have connections to legitimate antiquities dealers, or they've been stealing authentic materials to use in their forgeries. Or both," Maya realized. A chill went down her spine. They've been building this operation for years. Stealing authentic medieval documents, carefully removing the text while preserving the vellum, then adding new content to create forgeries that would fool even sophisticated authentication. She looked up at Lorenzo. "How many documents have you purchased in the last 5 years that might have been created this way?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "We're going to find out." He pulled out his phone, made a call. "Costa, I need a full audit of every acquisition in the last 5 years. Everything. Cross-reference against stolen art databases. I want to know if we've been buying recycled stolen documents." As he spoke, Maya studied the photographs more closely. Something had been bothering her since the warehouse, a detail that seemed significant but that she couldn't quite place. Then she saw it. Professor Kellner, the academic who'd been working with the kidnappers. In one of the photographs, she could see part of a tattoo on his wrist, a small symbol that looked like a combination of letters and numbers. She'd seen that symbol before. Recently. "Dr. Rogers." Lorenzo had ended his call and was watching her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Maya said slowly. "A pattern." She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her notes from the past few days. "Here, Professor Whitmore, who authenticated the Romano Codex. I took notes during his presentation. He mentioned working with a research group at Oxford." She showed Lorenzo her phone screen. "The Oxford Medieval Studies Consortium. Logo is 3 letters intertwined. O, M, and S." She pointed to the photograph of Kellner. "Same tattoo. Same organization." Lorenzo's eyes went cold. "How many other academics have been working with this consortium?" "That's what we need to find out," Maya said. "Because I'm starting to think this isn't just about forgeries. This is about something much bigger. The consortium wouldn't go to this much trouble just to sell you fake documents. They want something else." "What?" Maya looked at the scattered photographs, the evidence of months or possibly years of planning. "Access to your collection, your resources, your network. The question is, access for what?" Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tomorrow," he said, "we find out. And Maya, for the first time since this started, we stop reacting and start hunting." Maya realized that working for Lorenzo Romano was about to become considerably more dangerous. But as she looked at the evidence spread across the table, as she thought about Marco's narrow escape and the sophisticated conspiracy that had been targeting Lorenzo for months, she also realized something else. She was ready for it. The invisible waitress was gone. In her place was someone who could spot lies, survive gunfights, and stand up to men who used violence as a negotiating tactic. Someone who was about to help Lorenzo Romano hunt down the people who'd tried to destroy him. And despite the danger, despite the moral complexity, despite the fact that her mother would probably have a heart attack if she knew the truth, Maya was looking forward to it. The hunt was about to begin. 3 weeks later, the dominoes began to fall. It started with Professor Kellner, who, facing federal charges for kidnapping and art fraud, decided that cooperation was preferable to prison. His testimony led to search warrants for the Oxford Medieval Studies Consortium, which led to the discovery of a workshop in London where authentic medieval documents were being systematically destroyed to create forgery materials. The workshop led to a network that spanned 3 countries and included 12 academics, for auction houses, and at least 6 major collectors who'd been unknowingly purchasing elaborate fakes. The total fraud was estimated at over $400 million. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered the real target of the conspiracy. Lorenzo Romano hadn't been chosen randomly. The consortium had been specifically targeting him because his collection included a particular document they needed. A 14th-century Sicilian land grant that established water rights to a section of Sicily that was about to become very valuable. A section that, according to geological surveys, was sitting on top of one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the Mediterranean. Someone had been planning to claim those water rights using forged documentation, but they needed Lorenzo's authentic grant to disappear first. The kidnapping, the elaborate forgeries, the systematic infiltration of his authentication process, all of it had been designed to either steal the document or discredit Lorenzo to the point where his ownership could be legally challenged. Maya discovered this during her own investigation, tracing provenance records and cross-referencing geological surveys with medieval land grants. When she presented her findings to Lorenzo, he looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You realize," he said, "that you just uncovered a conspiracy that would have stolen water rights worth billions of dollars." "More than that," Maya said. "We stopped them from stealing the water itself. That aquifer supplies drinking water to 500,000 people." She paused. This wasn't just about money. It was about a basic human right. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the safe where he kept his most valuable documents and pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside was the 14th-century land grant, the document that had been the real target all along. He handed it to Maya. "The grant gives my family legal claim to 50,000 acres of Sicilian land and the water rights underneath. As of last week, the Sicilian government approached me about purchasing those rights to ensure the aquifer remains in public ownership." She looked up at him. "Are you selling?" Lorenzo smiled. "I'm donating them to a foundation that will ensure the water remains available to everyone who needs it. The foundation will be run by someone who understands the importance of protecting truth. Someone who can spot a lie from across the room. Someone who believes water belongs to people, not corporations. Maya stared at him. You're offering me a job, running a foundation. I'm offering you a purpose. The authentication work pays well, but this would do something more. It would make a difference. Maya thought about her mother, about 3 years of invisibility, about the moment she'd chosen to speak up in that conference room, about truth and power, and the responsibility that came with the ability to spot deception. Yes, she said simply. When do I start? 6 months later, the Romano Foundation for Historic Preservation and Public Resources held its opening ceremony in the same building where Maya had first met Lorenzo. The conference room had been converted into a reception hall, filled with academics, journalists, and representatives from water conservation organizations around the world. Maya stood near the windows, wearing a black dress that had cost more than her old monthly rent, watching Lorenzo give a speech about the importance of protecting both historical truth and natural resources. She thought about her mother, whose treatment was going well enough that she'd been able to attend tonight. Elena Rogers sat at a table near the front, beaming with the pride of a woman whose daughter had gone from serving wine to running an international foundation. She thought about Marco, who'd recovered completely from his kidnapping and was now Lorenzo's head of security for the foundation. About Costa, who'd become her unlikely friend and protector. About the invisible waitress who'd been brave enough to say this is fake when everyone else was willing to accept a lie. Dr. Rogers. Lorenzo appeared beside her, handsome in his tuxedo, no longer the intimidating figure from that first night, but someone who'd become her partner in truth. Ready for your speech. As ready as someone can be for addressing an international audience about the intersection of historical preservation and water rights, she said. So terrified but committed. Perfect. He smiled. That's the best way to change the world. Maya looked out at the crowd, at the journalists who would carry this story to millions of people, at the academics who would ensure the foundation's work continued, at her mother who was crying happy tears into her cocktail napkin. She thought about truth and courage and the strange path that had led from invisibility to this moment. Then she walked to the podium to give a speech about why historical accuracy mattered, why natural resources belonged to everyone, and how sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was tell the truth at exactly the right moment. The invisible waitress was gone forever. In her place stood Dr. Maya Rogers, director of the Romano Foundation, protector of truth, guardian of public resources, and proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon against deception was simply the courage to speak up. As she began her speech, Maya caught Lorenzo's eye across the room. He raised his glass in a small salute, and she smiled back before turning to face the crowd. Maya started invisible and ended up seen. Lorenzo started alone and ended up loved. And you just experienced a story about truth, courage, and the kind of love that's worth fighting for. If you want more stories that make you feel something, stories that remind you why romance and danger and wit make the perfect combination, then subscribe. We're building a community of people who believe in powerful storytelling. Join us. Click subscribe, explore our other videos, and let's keep telling stories that matter. See you in the comments. Tell me your favorite moment from this. 2 years had passed since the Romano Foundation's opening ceremony, and Maya Rogers had learned that running an international foundation came with complications she'd never anticipated in graduate school. The foundation's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Lower Manhattan, with offices in Sicily, London, and Geneva. What had started as a simple water rights protection organization had evolved into something far more complex, something that attracted attention from people who preferred to operate in shadows. Maya stood in her corner office, reviewing intelligence reports that read like thriller novels. The Oxford Medieval Studies Consortium had been dismantled, but its network had spawned other organizations. The market for sophisticated forgeries hadn't disappeared. It had simply become more careful, more dangerous, and more international. Costa knocked on her doorframe, a gesture of courtesy that still amused Maya after 2 years of working together. Dr. Rogers, we have a problem. Maya looked up from the reports. Define problem. Someone just tried to buy the Venetian collection from the Hartwell estate, using documentation that claims you've authenticated their provenance. Costa handed her a tablet showing auction listings. Problem is, you've never seen these documents, and the Hartwell family is asking questions. Maya studied the listings. 15 Renaissance manuscripts, 2 Byzantine icons, and a collection of Sicilian noble seals dating from the 14th to 16th centuries. The kind of artifacts that would be worth tens of millions if authentic, worthless if fake, and potentially priceless if they contained hidden legal significance. Someone's using my reputation to legitimize forgeries, she said. But why these specific pieces? What's special about the Hartwell collection? Costa pulled up another screen on the tablet. The Hartwell estate includes 40,000 acres in southeastern Sicily, the same region where we established the water rights protection. According to geological surveys conducted last month, there may be a second aquifer, even larger than the first one. Maya's blood went cold. Someone's trying to establish historical claims to more water rights, using forged documents authenticated by me to challenge the Foundation's legal standing. It gets worse, Costa said. The buyer isn't using his real name, but our intelligence suggests it's Matteo Romano, Lorenzo's cousin. The one who'd been in federal custody. Was in federal custody. He was released 6 months ago. Apparently, good behavior and an expensive legal team convinced the parole board he'd reformed. Costa's expression was grim. Capo thinks otherwise. Where is Lorenzo now? Maya asked. Sicily. He flew out yesterday when we got word about someone surveying Foundation lands without authorization. He's meeting with local officials, trying to determine who's been asking questions about water rights. Maya reached for her phone, but Costa held up a hand. Already tried. He's not answering. Neither is his security team. The office suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Maya walked to the windows overlooking the Hudson River, watching traffic move along the West Side Highway like blood cells through arteries. Everything looked normal, peaceful, completely disconnected from the reality that someone was systematically attacking the Foundation and possibly targeting Lorenzo. How long since his last check-in? She asked. 18 hours. Maya turned back to Costa. Book us flights to Sicily. Tonight. Dr. Rogers, if Capo is in trouble, Sicily isn't safe for you either. Matteo blames you for exposing the original conspiracy. You're probably his primary target. Then we'd better get there before he has time to set another trap. Maya was already moving toward her desk, gathering the documents she'd need. Alert Marco. Tell him to coordinate with our Sicilian contacts. And Costa. Yes, doctor. Pack the authentication equipment. If Matteo is using forged documents to challenge our water rights, I want to be ready to prove they're fake. Costa nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Dr. Rogers, you realize this could be exactly what Matteo wants. To draw you to Sicily, away from your security, your resources, your support network. Maya thought about Lorenzo, alone in Sicily with enemies closing in. Thought about the foundation they'd built together, the water rights that protected 500,000 people, the trust that had grown between them from professional respect into something deeper and more complex. Maybe, she said, but I can't protect the Foundation from New York if Lorenzo's dead in Sicily. Sometimes you have to take the risk. The flight to Sicily was turbulent, both meteorologically and emotionally. Maya spent 8 hours reviewing intelligence reports, studying geological surveys, and analyzing the forged documents that Matteo was using to challenge the Foundation's claims. What she discovered made her stomach clench with dread. The forgeries were sophisticated, nearly perfect. Someone had learned from the consortium's mistakes. These documents didn't use recycled medieval materials. They used completely authentic 15th century vellum that had never been written on. Virgin parchment that had been stored for centuries and was now being used to create brand new historical lies. Even more disturbing was the legal strategy. Matteo wasn't trying to steal the water rights directly. He was challenging the Foundation's legal standing by claiming that Lorenzo had never had legitimate ownership of the original land grants. If successful, the challenge would invalidate the Foundation's authority and return the water rights to the Romano family, specifically to Matteo as Lorenzo's closest living relative. Costa leaned over her shoulder as she worked. How is he getting authentic blank vellum from the 15th century? Maya looked up from her laptop. There are private collectors who specialize in unused historical materials. Blank pages from medieval manuscripts, and used parchment from monastery scriptoriums, even blank pages cut from existing codices. It's legal to buy, legal to sell, and if you're patient enough to acquire enough authentic materials, you can create forgeries that will fool any authentication process, Costa finished. Exactly. The materials are genuinely 15th century. The inks can be period appropriate. Even the binding techniques can be historically accurate. The only way to prove they're fake is to demonstrate that the documents didn't exist until recently, which requires proving a negative, Costa said grimly. Nearly impossible. Not impossible, Maya said, closing her laptop as the plane began its descent into Palermo. Just very, very difficult. She looked out the window at the Sicilian coast, beautiful and deceptively peaceful in the morning sunlight. Good thing I specialize in very difficult authentication problems. The rental car Costa had arranged was armored, a precaution that Maya was beginning to appreciate. As they drove through the Sicilian countryside toward the Foundation's regional headquarters, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that followed them for more than a few turns, every figure that seemed to pay too much attention to their vehicle, every building with windows that could conceal a sniper's position. The Foundation's Sicilian office was located in a renovated 16th-century palazzo in the hills outside Palermo, chosen specifically for its historical significance and its strategic position overlooking the valley where the aquifer was located. As they approached the building, Maya could see that something was wrong. Too many cars in the parking area, too much activity for a normal business day, and most telling of all, security personnel who didn't belong to the Foundation. Costa pulled over a kilometer away from the building. Dr. Rogers, that's not our security. Maya studied the scene through binoculars. Men in expensive suits with earpieces and weapons that were probably illegal in most countries. Professional, organized, and definitely not friendly. Matteo's people, she said. How many? At least 8 visible. Probably more inside. Costa was already on his phone, speaking in rapid Italian to contacts Maya didn't recognize. He listened for a moment, then hung up. Capo never made it to the office yesterday. His car was found abandoned 20 kilometers from here. Maya's heart stopped. Is he? Unknown. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just gone. Costa's jaw was tight with controlled anger. Our contacts think he's being held somewhere in the valley, possibly in one of the old monastery buildings. Matteo's been purchasing property in the area for months. Which monastery? Maya asked. Costa showed her a map on his phone. San Michele del Monte, built in the 13th century, abandoned for 200 years, recently purchased by a shell corporation that our investigators traced to Matteo's network. Maya studied the map, noting the monastery's position relative to the aquifer, to the Foundation office, and to the roads that would provide escape routes. The location was perfect for someone who wanted to control access to the water rights while remaining hidden from official scrutiny. It's a trap, she said. Matteo has Lorenzo. He's taken over our office, and he's waiting for me to walk into the monastery so he can eliminate both of us and claim the water rights for himself. Probably, Costa agreed. What do you want to do? Maya looked at the monastery on the map, thinking about Lorenzo somewhere in those ancient buildings, thinking about the water rights that protected 500,000 people, thinking about the choice between safety and truth that had defined her entire relationship with the Romano family. We spring the trap, she said, but we do it on our terms. The plan was either brilliant or suicidal, and Maya wasn't entirely certain which. Costa had contacts throughout Sicily, men who'd worked with Lorenzo for years and who owed their loyalty to him rather than to his cousin. Within 4 hours, they'd assembled a small army of electricians, plumbers, telecommunications workers, and utility maintenance personnel who could move through the countryside without attracting attention. Maya's role was straightforward and terrifying. She would approach the monastery openly, carrying authentication equipment and claiming to be there to examine the forged documents that Matteo was using to challenge the water rights. She would be unarmed, unprotected, and completely vulnerable, but she would also be carrying equipment that included more than just authentication tools. The portable X-ray machine contained a GPS transmitter that would allow Costa's team to track her location inside the monastery. The chemical analysis kit included a two-way radio disguised as a spectrometer. Even her laptop had been modified to send location data and record audio continuously. As Maya drove alone toward the monastery, she thought about how far she'd traveled from the invisible waitress who'd served wine at Il Palazzo. That woman had been afraid to speak up, afraid to be seen, afraid to risk everything for the truth. This woman was driving toward almost certain danger because someone she cared about was in trouble and because 500,000 people depended on the Foundation's protection. The monastery appeared around a curve in the mountain road, like something from a Gothic novel. Ancient stone walls, empty windows, a bell tower that had been silent for centuries, and vehicles parked in the courtyard that definitely hadn't been there when the building was abandoned. Maya parked near the main entrance and gathered her equipment with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. The authentication gear was heavy, professional, and hopefully convincing enough to maintain the fiction that this was a legitimate business meeting rather than a rescue mission. As she approached the monastery entrance, two men in expensive suits emerged from the shadows. Professional security, the kind that Lorenzo employed, but their body language suggested they worked for someone else now. Dr. Rogers, one of them said with the courtesy of someone who could afford to be polite because he held all the power. Mr. Romano is expecting you. Maya followed them through corridors that smelled of age and abandonment, past empty rooms where monks had once lived and prayed, toward the heart of the building where someone had created a modern command center in medieval surroundings. The room they led her to had been the monastery's library, with stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and enough space for the tables, computers, and communications equipment that Matteo had installed. Ancient and modern technology side by side, connected by the ambition of a man who wanted to steal water from 500,000 people. Matteo Romano stood near the largest table, examining documents that Maya recognized as the forged land grants. He was younger than Lorenzo, handsome in a softer way, with the kind of charm that probably got him whatever he wanted until he encountered something that couldn't be charmed. Dr. Maya Rogers, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The famous authentication expert. Thank you for coming. Where is Lorenzo? Maya said. Safe. Nearby. Eager to see you, I'm sure. Matteo gestured toward the documents on the table. But first, we have business to discuss. I understand you have questions about these land grants. Maya approached the table, noting the positions of the guards, the locations of the exits, the equipment that might be useful as weapons if necessary. The documents were beautifully presented, arranged on archival foam with professional lighting that would make authentication easier. But as she studied them, Maya realized they weren't just forgeries. They were perfect forgeries, created with a level of skill and knowledge that went far beyond anything the Oxford Consortium had achieved. These are extraordinary, she said, pulling out her authentication equipment. The vellum is genuinely 15th century. The inks are period appropriate. Even the binding techniques are historically accurate. She looked up at Matteo. Where did you find them? Actually, Matteo said, I didn't find them. I commissioned them. From an artist who specializes in historical recreation. Someone who learned from the consortium's mistakes and developed new techniques for creating documents that are historically accurate in every detail except their actual age. Maya continued examining the documents while processing this information. Matteo was admitting to forgery, which meant he was confident that she wouldn't be leaving the monastery to testify against him. The question, he continued, is whether you'll authenticate them as genuine. Your reputation is such that your certification would establish their legitimacy beyond any reasonable doubt. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid your usefulness to me ends. Along with your life. And Lorenzo's. Matteo's smile became genuinely cold. But I'm hoping you'll be reasonable. The water rights are worth billions of dollars. There's enough profit to ensure your comfort for the rest of your life, however long that might be. Maya looked at the documents again, thinking about the GPS tracker in her equipment, the audio recording device, the rescue team that was hopefully positioning itself around the monastery. All she had to do was delay long enough for Costa's people to get into position. These documents established that your family never had legitimate claim to the water rights, she said, that the original land grants were fraudulent. Exactly. The Foundation's legal standing disappears. The water rights revert to the Romano family, specifically to me as Lorenzo's closest heir. A few bribes to local officials, and I control one of the largest freshwater sources in the Mediterranean. And 500,000 people lose access to clean water. Matteo shrugged. Progress requires sacrifice. Besides, I'm not planning to eliminate access, just to monetize it. Water is a commodity like any other. Maya felt her phone vibrate once, the signal that Costa's team was in position. Everything that happened next would determine whether Lorenzo lived, whether the Foundation survived, and whether 500,000 people kept their access to clean water. "You know what?" she said, setting down her authentication equipment and looking directly at Matteo. "I have a better idea." "Which is?" Maya smiled, the same sharp smile she'd learned from Lorenzo. "Absolute honesty. The authentication equipment includes recording devices. Everything you've said in the last 10 minutes has been transmitted to authorities in 3 countries. The documents are forgeries. You've admitted to conspiracy and kidnapping. And in about 30 seconds, this building is going to be surrounded by people who don't work for you." Matteo's expression went from confident to furious in the space of a heartbeat. "Kill her," he shouted to his guards. But Maya was already moving, diving behind the stone table as gunfire erupted throughout the monastery. The authentication equipment scattered across the floor, but the transmitters kept working, broadcasting the location of every shot fired. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouted orders, Maya heard the sound she'd been waiting for. Explosions, precisely placed to breach the monastery's walls. Costa's team wasn't just positioned around the building, they were coming through it. Maya stayed behind the stone table, listening to the battle rage around her. Professional security against professional security, fought in a medieval building that had been designed to withstand siege warfare. Ancient walls that could stop bullets, narrow corridors that could be defended or become death traps. And somewhere in this labyrinth, Lorenzo was waiting to be rescued. The gunfire gradually decreased, replaced by shouted orders in Italian and the sound of surrender. Maya waited until she heard Costa's voice before emerging from behind the table. "Dr. Rogers, are you injured?" "Not yet," she said, looking around the destroyed library. "Where's Lorenzo?" Costa pointed toward a corridor that led deeper into the monastery. "Capo's in the old chapel." "He's..." Costa hesitated. "He's been shot, but he's conscious. Demanding to see you, actually." Maya ran through corridors filled with smoke and spent ammunition, past Costa's men who were securing the building and tending to wounded. The chapel was in the monastery's oldest section, a vaulted stone room that had been converted into a makeshift prison. Lorenzo sat propped against the altar, his left shoulder bandaged, but his eyes alert and furious. When he saw Maya, his expression shifted from anger to relief to something deeper that made her heart skip. "You came," he said as she knelt beside him. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you wouldn't. Too dangerous. But I'm glad you ignored good sense." His hand found hers, gripped with surprising strength for someone who'd been shot. "Is Matteo alive? In custody?" Talking extensively about water rights fraud, conspiracy, and his plans to monetize the aquifer. Costa's people recorded everything. "Good. The Foundation. Safe. The water rights are secure. 500,000 people still have access to clean water." Maya brushed his hair back from his forehead, noting that he was paler than he should be, but stable. "And the authentication equipment performed flawlessly. I'm thinking of adding kidnapping rescue to my professional services." Lorenzo laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "Extra charge for rescues involving gunfights in medieval buildings." "Definitely." She helped him sit up straighter, aware that Costa's medics were approaching with professional equipment. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot and held captive by my psychotic cousin, but grateful to be alive." He studied her face, noting the adrenaline flush, the determined expression, the woman who'd walked into a trap to save him. "You've changed since that first night at Il Palazzo." "So have you." "How so?" "You trust people now. You let me come after you instead of trying to handle everything alone." Lorenzo's smile was soft, genuine, completely different from the sharp expression that had intimidated her 3 years ago. "I trust you. There's a difference." Before Maya could respond, the medics arrived with stretchers and professional medical equipment. Lorenzo would be flown to a hospital in Palermo, then to New York for surgery and recovery. The Foundation would need temporary leadership while Maya dealt with legal proceedings against Matteo and his co-conspirators. But as they prepared to leave the monastery, as Maya watched Lorenzo being carefully transferred to a medical stretcher, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. What had started as a professional relationship built on mutual respect had become something deeper, more complex, and entirely outside the boundaries of normal employer-employee dynamics. "Dr. Rogers, Costa appeared beside her as they prepared to leave the chapel. "There's something you should see." Maya followed him to a side chamber where Costa's team had discovered Mateo's operational headquarters. Computer equipment, communications gear, and most importantly, files that documented the scope of his conspiracy. It wasn't just about the water rights, Costa explained, showing her financial records and correspondence. Mateo had been building a network to acquire water rights throughout the Mediterranean. Sicily was just the beginning. He had plans for projects in Spain, Greece, southern France, anywhere there were underdeveloped freshwater resources and complex historical land claims. Maya studied the documents, realizing that they'd uncovered something far larger than a family dispute over Sicilian water rights. This was an international conspiracy to privatize water resources using forged historical documents to establish legal claims. "How many other families has he approached?" she asked. "At least 12 that we can identify. All with historical land claims. All with potential access to water resources. All being offered partnerships in what Mateo called water heritage development." Maya felt sick. He was going to steal water from millions of people using fake history to establish legal claims. "Was going to," Costa corrected. Past tense. "Thanks to your authentication skills and willingness to walk into a monastery full of armed men, his entire operation is finished." As they prepared to leave the monastery, Maya looked back at the ancient building that had served as the setting for a very modern conspiracy. Medieval stones that had witnessed centuries of history. Now the site where historical forgery had been used to attempt one of the largest theft operations in history. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "How's the business trip, sweetie? Hope you're staying safe." Maya looked around at the bullet holes in stone walls, the scattered authentication equipment, the evidence of a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in stealing water from millions of people. She typed back, "All good, Mom. Just some complicated authentication work. I'll tell you about it when I get home." Which was, Maya reflected, technically accurate if not entirely complete. Her mother didn't need to know that authentication work now included armed rescues in medieval buildings. The flight back to New York gave Maya time to process everything that had happened. Mateo was in custody facing charges in 3 countries. The forged documents had been exposed and would be used as evidence in multiple fraud cases. The Foundation's water rights were secure, and the Sicilian aquifer would remain in public ownership. Lorenzo was recovering well from surgery, though he'd be in the hospital for another week. Maya had visited him before her flight, finding him alert, irritated by the hospital food, and planning the Foundation's expansion into water rights protection throughout the Mediterranean. But what occupied Maya's thoughts during the long flight wasn't the successful resolution of the case. It was the moment in the chapel when Lorenzo had looked at her with something deeper than professional respect or personal gratitude. Something that suggested their relationship was evolving beyond the boundaries they'd carefully maintained for 3 years. Maya had fallen in love with her complicated, dangerous, brilliant employer. And based on the way he'd looked at her in that ancient chapel, the feeling might be mutual. The question was what to do about it. The Foundation's work was too important to be compromised by personal relationships. The board of directors expected professional leadership. Her mother expected her daughter to have a normal life with someone who didn't get shot on a regular basis. But as the plane descended toward New York, Maya realized that normal had never been an option. From the moment she'd spoken up in that Il Palazzo conference room, she'd been choosing truth over safety, purpose over security, meaningful work over conventional expectations. And Lorenzo Romano, for all his complications and dangers, represented the choice to live authentically rather than safely. Maya's phone buzzed as the plane taxied toward the gate. A text from Lorenzo. "Thank you for saving my life. Again, when you're ready to discuss the future, I'll be in room 2847 at Mount Sinai. We have things to talk about." Maya smiled, gathering her belongings as passengers prepared to disembark. Yes, they definitely had things to talk about. Important things about the Foundation's expansion, about international water rights protection, about the authentication protocols they'd need to prevent future forgery conspiracies. And possibly, if they were both brave enough, about the fact that professional partnerships sometimes evolved into something deeper, more complex, and worth protecting. Maya Rogers, former Invisible Waitress, current Foundation Director, authentication expert, and survivor of multiple assassination attempts, was ready for the conversation, whatever it led to. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, institutional cleanliness that couldn't quite mask the underlying reality of human vulnerability. Maya carried flowers from the gift shop and coffee from the cafeteria, peace offerings for a man who was probably climbing the walls from forced inactivity. She knocked on the door to room 2847, heard Lorenzo's voice telling her to enter, and stepped into a space that looked more like a business office than a hospital room. Lorenzo had somehow acquired multiple laptops, 3 phones, a secure tablet, and enough paperwork to run a small corporation from his hospital bed. "You're supposed to be recovering," Maya said, setting the flowers on the windowsill and handing him the coffee. "I'm supposed to be protecting the Foundation from water thieves and international forgery conspiracies." Lorenzo accepted the coffee gratefully. "Recovery is a luxury I can't afford while there are 12 other families being targeted by Mateo's network." Maya sat in the visitor's chair, noting that despite his protestations, Lorenzo looked healthier than she'd expected. Color back in his face, the alertness that came from proper rest and medical care, and only minor movement restrictions from the shoulder wound. "The other families are safe," she said. "Interpol has been coordinating with local authorities throughout the Mediterranean. Every family Mateo approached has been warned, and their legal claims are being reviewed by authentication experts." "Good. But that's damage control, not prevention. We need to address the underlying problem." Lorenzo set down his coffee and leaned forward with the intensity that Maya had learned meant he was about to propose something ambitious and probably dangerous. "The international market for sophisticated forgeries is growing. Water rights are just the beginning. Climate change is making fresh water increasingly valuable, which means historical land claims are becoming targets for fraud." Maya could see where this was heading. "You want to expand the Foundation's mission. I want to create an international authentication network. Independent experts, standardized protocols, secure databases. Make it impossible for future Mateos to commission forgeries that can fool legitimate authentication processes." He pulled out one of his tablets, showed her organizational charts and budget projections. "The Foundation has the resources, the reputation, and the expertise to lead this effort." Maya studied the plans, recognizing the scope and complexity of what Lorenzo was proposing. This would be more than expanding the Foundation. It would be creating an entirely new approach to protecting historical truth and preventing fraud. "It would work," she said, "but it would also make us targets for everyone involved in international art fraud, historical document theft, and resource acquisition conspiracy." "Yes," Lorenzo agreed. "Which brings me to the personal conversation we need to have." Maya's heart rate increased slightly. She'd been dreading and anticipating this moment since the monastery. "Maya," Lorenzo said quietly, "the work we're doing is important enough to risk our lives for. I've proven that repeatedly, and after yesterday, so have you. But it's also dangerous enough that personal relationships become complicated." He paused, studying her face with the intensity she'd learned to recognize as his way of gauging her reaction to serious propositions. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "Have been for months. And I think, based on your willingness to walk into an armed monastery to rescue me, that the feeling might be mutual." Maya felt her breath catch. 3 years of careful professional boundaries. 3 years of maintaining appropriate distance. 3 years of pretending that working closely with Lorenzo hadn't affected her in ways that went far beyond professional admiration. "Yes," she said. "The feeling is definitely mutual." "Good." Lorenzo's smile was soft, genuine, completely different from the sharp expressions she'd seen him use in business negotiations. "Then we have a problem to solve. How do we build a personal relationship while running an international foundation that makes us targets for some of the most dangerous criminal networks in the world?" Maya thought about this for a moment, considering the practical complications of loving someone whose work attracted assassination attempts on a regular basis. Carefully, she said, "With excellent security protocols, clear professional boundaries in public and private moments when we can be honest about the fact that we're building something together that goes beyond the Foundation." Lorenzo reached for her hand, laced their fingers together with the gentle touch of someone who'd learned to value what could be lost. "I can live with carefully," he said, "as long as carefully doesn't mean separately." "It doesn't," Maya assured him. She thought about her mother, who'd been asking pointed questions about Maya's personal life ever since the Foundation's opening ceremony. "It means we tell my mother that you're more than my employer, and she insists on cooking dinner for you once you're released from the hospital." Lorenzo laughed. "Is your mother as terrifying as mine was?" "More so. She spent 3 years watching me work as a waitress while fighting cancer. She has very strong opinions about people who waste opportunities and time. Then I'd better make sure I meet her expectations." Maya squeezed his hand. Looking at this man who'd gone from intimidating Mafia boss to Foundation partner to something deeper and more complex than she'd ever expected to find. "Just be yourself," she said. "The version of yourself that donates water rights to protect 500,000 people. She'll love that version. What about the version that gets shot on a regular basis? We'll ease her into that part." Lorenzo was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the seriousness that Maya had learned meant he was making important decisions. "Maya, if we're doing this, if we're building something personal while running the Foundation, I need you to understand the risks. The authentication network will make us powerful enemies. People who profit from forgeries, from stolen art, from historical fraud. Our relationship makes us both more vulnerable because anyone who wants to hurt one of us can target the other." Maya had been thinking about this since the monastery, considering the practical reality of loving someone whose work attracted dangerous attention. "Then we'd better be very good at protecting each other," she said. "And very good at making sure the work is worth the risk." "It is worth the risk," Lorenzo said firmly. "Water rights, historical truth, preventing international fraud conspiracies. This work matters more than our personal safety." "I know," Maya said. "That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you." She smiled. "Along with your appreciation for authentic medieval calligraphy and your willingness to listen when waitresses point out obvious forgeries." "Former waitresses," Lorenzo corrected. "Current Foundation directors who save my life on a regular basis." "Current partners," Maya said. "In every sense of the word." Lorenzo's expression became serious, intense in the way that meant he was about to say something important. "Partners," he repeated, as if testing the word. "In the Foundation's work, in protecting water rights, in building the authentication network. In everything." "Everything," Maya confirmed. 6 months later, the Romano Foundation announced the launch of the International Historical Authentication Network, a collaborative effort involving institutions in 15 countries dedicated to preventing fraud involving historical documents and cultural artifacts. Dr. Maya Rogers was named as the network's director, while Lorenzo Romano continued as the Foundation's chairman. The announcement was made at a press conference in Geneva, with representatives from major museums, universities, and law enforcement agencies present to discuss the growing threat of sophisticated forgeries in the international art market. What the press conference didn't mention was that Maya and Lorenzo had been quietly married 3 weeks earlier in a small ceremony in Sicily, attended only by Maya's mother, Costa, Marco, and a select group of friends who understood that the bride and groom's work made large public celebrations inadvisable for security reasons. Elena Rogers had indeed loved the version of Lorenzo who protected water rights and fought international fraud conspiracies. She'd been less enthusiastic about the bulletproof vest he'd worn to the wedding ceremony and the armed security perimeter that Costa had insisted upon, but she'd adapted with the resilience of a woman who'd survived cancer and 3 years of watching her daughter work as a waitress while hiding a graduate degree. Maya kept her maiden name for professional purposes, partly because her reputation as an authentication expert was valuable to the Foundation's work, but mostly because she liked the symmetry of Maya Rogers working with Lorenzo Romano. Equal partners in work that mattered, even when it was dangerous. The network's first major success came 4 months after its launch, when coordinated investigations in 6 countries uncovered a forgery ring that had been creating fake historical documents to support illegal mining claims in protected areas throughout Eastern Europe. The operation had been sophisticated enough to fool local authentication experts, but the network's standardized protocols and international database had revealed inconsistencies that exposed the fraud. Maya stood in her office in the Foundation's New York headquarters, reviewing reports from network affiliates around the world. Success stories were accumulating rapidly. Fraudulent land claims exposed in Spain. Stolen artifacts recovered in Greece. A conspiracy to steal water rights in southern France prevented before it could succeed. The work was dangerous, complex, and absolutely necessary. Climate change was increasing pressure on natural resources, making historical land claims increasingly valuable targets for fraud. The authentication network was providing protection that governments and local institutions couldn't offer individually. Lorenzo appeared in her doorway, carrying coffee and wearing the expression that meant he had news to share. The board approved the expansion proposal, he said, setting coffee on her desk. 15 new member institutions, 6 additional countries, and enough funding to double our authentication capacity. Maya smiled, noting that Lorenzo looked healthier than she'd seen him since the monastery incident. Marriage apparently agreed with him, despite their unconventional work circumstances. Good, she said, because I just received authentication requests from institutions in 8 countries. The demand is already exceeding our capacity. He sat across from her desk, the position they'd maintained for professional meetings even after their relationship had become personal. Clear boundaries between foundation business and private conversations, a protocol that helped them maintain objectivity in their work. There's something else, Lorenzo said. Costa's intelligence network has identified a new threat. Someone's been inquiring about our personal security arrangements, asking questions about our schedules, our travel patterns, our protection protocols. Maya set down her coffee, immediately alert. Another cousin with inherited grievances. Unknown. Could be anyone from Mateo's network. Could be someone new who objects to our interference in international fraud operations. The point is, we're being targeted again. How concerned should I be? Concerned enough to accept additional security. Costa wants to assign personal protection teams for both of us. Full-time coverage, armored vehicles, secure communications. Maya thought about this, considering the balance between safety and the ability to do their work effectively. Will we still be able to travel for authentication work? Yes, but with more planning, more security, more restrictions on spontaneous activities. Such as surprise dinners at small restaurants, walking through Central Park without bodyguards, visiting your mother without a security sweep of her neighborhood. Maya was quiet for a moment, thinking about the trade-offs that came with their work. The ability to prevent international fraud conspiracies in exchange for constant vigilance. The satisfaction of protecting historical truth and natural resources in exchange for personal freedom. It's worth it, she said finally. The work is worth the restrictions. I agree, but I want to make sure you understand what you're accepting. This level of security means our private life becomes more complicated, more constrained, more carefully managed. Maya looked at Lorenzo across the desk, seeing the man who'd listened when she'd pointed out a forgery, who'd trusted her expertise even when it challenged powerful people, who'd built a foundation dedicated to protecting truth and public resources. I'm not accepting restrictions, she said. I'm accepting responsibility. For the network, for the people who depend on clean water, for the institutions that trust our authentication work. The restrictions are just practical details. Lorenzo's expression shifted from serious to something deeper, more personal. How did I get so lucky? He said quietly, as to find someone who understands that truth is worth protecting, even when protection comes with a price. You listened when a waitress told you something was fake, Maya reminded him. That was either very smart or very lucky. Both, Lorenzo said. Definitely both. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from Costa. Security team briefing in conference room 2. 15 minutes. Ready for the next phase? She asked, standing and gathering the files they'd need for the security meeting. Ready, Lorenzo confirmed. Though I should warn you, Costa's idea of adequate security tends toward the paranoid. Good, Maya said. Given our track record with assassination attempts and international conspiracies, paranoid sounds about right. As they walked toward the conference room, Maya reflected on the path that had led from that first night at Il Palazzo to this moment. From invisible waitress to foundation director to target of international criminal networks. From serving wine to protecting water rights. From hiding her expertise to building an authentication network that spanned continents. The work was dangerous, the security was restrictive, and the personal costs were higher than anything she'd imagined when she'd first spoken up in that private dining room. But as she looked at Lorenzo, as she thought about the water rights they'd protected and the fraud conspiracies they'd prevented, as she considered the authentication network that was making international historical fraud increasingly difficult, Maya knew she'd made the right choice. Truth was worth protecting. Water belonged to everyone. Historical accuracy mattered more than personal convenience. And love, when it was built on shared purpose and mutual respect, was strong enough to survive armed monasteries, international conspiracies, and even Costa's security protocols. Maya Rogers Romano, former Invisible Waitress, current Foundation Director, authentication expert, and partner in every sense of the word, was ready for whatever came next. The work would continue. The truth would be protected. And 500,000 people would continue to have access to clean water because a waitress had once been brave enough to say that something was fake. Everything else was just details. Maya started invisible and ended up seen. Lorenzo started alone and ended up loved. And you just experienced a story about truth, courage, and the kind of love that's worth fighting for. If you want more stories that make you feel something, stories that remind you why romance and danger and wit make the perfect combination, then subscribe. We're building a community of people who believe in powerful storytelling. Join us. Click subscribe, explore our other videos, and let's keep telling stories that matter. See you in the comments. Tell me your favorite moment from this.